there, welcome back to the YouTube channel for the Renaissance English History Podcast. I am your host, Heather. I've been podcasting on Tudor England since 2009 with my show, making it the original Tudor History Podcast. This channel is where I put all of my episodes from all of my shows, as well as tons of extra content like this video right here. Today, we are going to talk about the relationship between Thomas Cromwell and Stephen Gardiner. This is something that's come up in the comments for some of my Wolf Hall recap videos. And yesterday when I was doing season 1 with my hubby and we were doing our kind of reaction video, it came up as well as like who was Stephen Gardiner and what was their relationship, everything like that. So I thought I would just break it down in a video. So Stephen Gardiner and Thomas Cromwell. But before we get into it, if you would like to see more Tudor history in your YouTube feed, and I mean like who doesn't, go ahead and hit subscribe so you never miss a video that we put out. So the court of Henry VIII in the 1520s was no place for the faint of heart. It was a world where survival depended on having a sharp mind, political agility, and the ability to read Henry's mercurial moods. Two men who lived through this atmosphere, at least for a time, were Thomas Cromwell and Stephen Gardiner. Though their names would eventually come to symbolize opposite sides of the English Reformation, their early careers were strikingly similar. For a brief moment, they even seemed to be allies. Both men rose through the ranks under Cardinal Wolsey, the larger-than-life minister who held more power than anyone in England except for the king himself. Wolsey prized efficiency and brilliance, and both Cromwell and Gardiner delivered. Cromwell was born the son of a blacksmith, and he had carved out a career through sheer determination, learning the ropes of trade, law, and administration. Gardiner, on the other hand, came from a more traditional path, a Cambridge education and a career in the church. Yet they were both skilled administrators with a shared knack for solving problems, and Wolsey knew how to put their talents to use. Cromwell and Gardiner worked together on various projects, including Wolsey's ambitious, if ultimately doomed, schemes to consolidate power and reform the church. Gardiner became Wolsey's trusted diplomat, navigating tricky negotiations with Rome and foreign courts. Cromwell, meanwhile, was the man who made things happen at home, whether it was managing Wolsey's estates or drafting legislation. At this stage in their careers, there was no sign of the ideological battle that would later define their relationship. Cromwell wasn't yet the fiery reformer dismantling the Catholic Church's hold on England, and Gardiner wasn't yet his most vocal critic. The two were rising stars working in tandem to advance Wolsey's agenda. The turning point in their partnership came with the greatest crisis of Wolsey's career, Henry's Great Matter. The king's obsession with divorcing Catherine of Aragon and marrying Anne Boleyn would lead to Wolsey's downfall and forever alter the paths of Cromwell and Gardiner. Both men were drawn into the drama, though they would approach the problem from very different angles. Gardiner was a skilled theologian. He was sent to Rome to make the case for Henry's annulment. He argued very eloquently that the marriage was invalid due to Catherine's prior union with Henry's brother Arthur. His legal and theological expertise was undeniable, but his mission failed. The Pope, under pressure from Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, refused to grant the annulment. Cromwell, meanwhile, saw a different path forward. He believed that Henry didn't need the Pope's approval for his marriage. Instead, the king could declare himself the supreme head of the church in England and take matters into his own hands. This radical idea would eventually lead to the English Reformation and the break with Rome. While Gardiner was still trying to negotiate with the papacy, Cromwell was already setting the stage for a complete overhaul of England's religious landscape. As Cromwell's star rose, Gardiner found himself increasingly at odds with his former ally. Gardiner had no problem supporting Henry's authority over the church. He even co-authored De Vera Obedientia, a treatise defending the king's supremacy. But he was uncomfortable with the sweeping changes that Cromwell began to implement. The dissolution of the monasteries, the introduction of the English Bible, and the alignment with the Protestant ideas all ran counter to Gardiner's deeply held Catholic beliefs. The two men clashed repeatedly as Cromwell pushed forward with his reformist agenda. Gardiner was now the Bishop of Winchester, and he became one of the leading voices of the opposition. He argued that Cromwell's policies were destabilizing the kingdom and undermining traditional faith. Cromwell, in turn, saw Gardiner as a relic of the past, a stubborn defender of a system that no longer served England's needs. Their personal animosity was just as sharp as their ideological differences. Cromwell viewed Gardiner as overly cautious and self-serving, while Gardiner saw Cromwell as reckless and dangerously ambitious. Their rivalry played out in council meetings and court politics, with both men vying for influence over Henry VIII. At times, their disagreements became so heated that it was clear there was no room for reconciliation. As Cromwell consolidated his power in the 1530s, he became the architect of some of the most dramatic changes in English religious and political life. The dissolution of the monasteries was a transformative and deeply divisive act, sweeping away centuries of monastic tradition and redirecting their wealth into Henry VIII's wallets. For Gardiner, this was a step too far. While he supported Henry's authority over the church, he had no interest in dismantling its core structures or embracing Protestant theology. Gardiner's increasingly vocal objections to Cromwell's reforms brought their rivalry into sharp focus. Now, their disagreements weren't just theological, they were also tactical. Cromwell favored forging alliances with Protestant powers on the continent, particularly the Schmalkaldic League, which was a coalition of Lutheran princes. Gardiner, ever the pragmatist, recognized the dangers of alienating the Catholic powers like France and the Holy Roman Empire. For Gardiner, diplomacy required balance, not outright alignment with reformist factions. The tension between the two men played out not only in council meetings, but also in their correspondence. Gardiner was known for his sharp wit and his rhetorical skill. He often expressed objections in carefully crafted letters, subtly undermining Cromwell's proposals. Cromwell was less polished, but equally shrewd, and he countered with sheer force of will, with his unmatched ability to navigate Henry's volatile temperament. By the late 1530s, the relationship between Cromwell and Gardiner had deteriorated into outright mistrust. Gardiner suspected Cromwell of overstepping his bounds, particularly as Cromwell's policies seemed to edge England closer and closer to full-out Protestantism. Gardiner's fears weren't unfounded. Cromwell's patronage of reformist clergy and his support for English translations of the Bible were clear signs of his religious leanings. Gardiner, meanwhile, worked quietly to protect traditional practices, often positioning himself as the voice of caution in a court increasingly divided by religious factions. The rivalry reached a critical point when Cromwell orchestrated Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves in 1540. The match was intended to strengthen ties with Protestant allies, and it was a disaster, as we know. Henry found Anne unattractive, and they didn't get along. There was like a whole thing. I did a video on why they didn't get along. And he blamed Cromwell for his embarrassment. Sensing an opportunity, Gardiner and his allies, including the Duke of Norfolk, began to maneuver against Cromwell. They painted him as a man who had overreached, whose reforms had gone too far, and whose ambitions had threatened the stability of the realm. Gardiner's role in Cromwell's downfall was subtle but quite significant. While Norfolk took a more aggressive approach, Gardiner used his position as a trusted advisor to amplify doubts about Cromwell's loyalty and competence. He emphasized Cromwell's ties to Protestant reformers, knowing Henry's religious views were far more conservative than Cromwell's policies suggested. In June of 1540, Cromwell was arrested on charges of treason and heresy. The accusations were a mix of real grievances and manufactured conspiracies, but they were enough to seal his fate. Gardiner's fingerprints were all over the proceedings, though he had avoided the spotlight, allowing Norfolk to lead the charge. By July, Cromwell had been executed, his head displayed on a pike on London Bridge as a grim warning to others who might overreach in Henry's court. Gardiner's reaction to Cromwell's fall was measured. He had achieved his goal of neutralizing his rival, but he knew better than to gloat. The Tudor court was an unpredictable place, and alliances shifted with the wind. Gardiner's own position would later come under threat during Edward VI's Protestant reign, proving that no victory in court was ever final. The conflict between Cromwell and Gardiner wasn't just a personal feud, it was a battle over the soul of England's religious future. Cromwell's reforms laid the foundation for a Protestant England, even if some of his policies were rolled back after his death. Gardiner, for his part, remained a staunch defender of the Catholic religion and traditions, becoming a key figure in Mary's counter-Reformation efforts. It's easy to cast them as enemies, but in many ways they were two sides of the same coin. brilliant, pragmatic men navigating a dangerous and rapidly changing world. Their story reminds us that history is never just black and white. Cromwell and Gardiner may have clashed bitterly, but they were both products of their time, each trying to shape England's future in the image that they believed was right. So if you made it this far in the video and you enjoyed it, I sure would appreciate it. Press that like button. It helps to feed the algorithm and get our content to even more people. And I hope I earned your subscription to my channel where I put out content like this all the time. If you want to keep binging Tudor content, here's a video on Cromwell and Norfolk that you might enjoy. And here's one that YouTube thinks you'll like. Thanks so much for watching. Know that you are deeply loved. I'm so glad that I shared the planet with you. We'll be back very soon. In the meantime, don't forget to drink your water. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.